Good day, everyone. I am Takai Susum, President of the Security Strategy Research Institute of Japan. I really appreciate all of you for participating in this virtual seminar on changing of the situation in the international relations and security environment in East Asia and the response of the international community hosted by the Institute.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Takai. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. My name is Akiko Okamatsu, a professor of international law at Hosei University. And I would like to express my gratitude to be invited here to this seminar as a moderator. The theme of this seminar is changes of the situation in the international relations and security environment in East Asia and the response of the international community. We will discuss this theme focusing on mainly the issue regarding Senkaku Islands. Senkaku Islands have been a serious issue due to the different recognition of its legal status between Japan and China, and this situation leaves the problems unsolved for more than half century. Today, we will confirm the problems and analyze it dispassionately and indicate the possible way to the peaceful settlement. So, now the keynote speaker is Professor Susumu Takai, and the title is Maritime Security Environment in the East China Sea after the latest Coast Guard law of the People's Republic of China. Professor Takai, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Kamatsu. Now, I'd like to provide my presentation to you. The title of my presentation is Maritime Security Environment in East China Sea after the latest Coast Guard law of the People's Republic of China. The China Coast Guard was established in 2013 under the newly elected Xi Jinping as the president and put it under the command of the Central Military Committee in June 2020. I'd say the PRC did it within 10 years. The PRC also enacted the China Coast Guard Law in 2021, which permits CCG ships all necessary means including use of weapons against unlawful foreign ships in the waters of the PRC's jurisdiction. The PRC Wolf Warrior diplomacy changes security environment in the East China Sea for the worse. In 1885, the Okinawa Prefecture officials landed and conducted investigation of the Senkaku Islands, which were terra nullius at that time. Japan incorporated the Senkaku Islands to Japan's territory in 14 January 1895. There lived some 240 inhabitants, including children, and their settlers engaged in various economic activities such as industry of dried bonito production until the beginning of the World War II. The peace treaty with Japan placed the Ryukyu Islands under the U.S. administration in 1952. The U.S. Ryukyu government continued to effective control over the Senkaku Islands, and the U.S. returned the Ryukyu Islands, including the Senkaku Islands, to Japan in 1972. Japanese government continues to exercise effective control over the Senkaku Islands up to the present. The PRC suddenly began to make their own assertions of territorial sovereignty over the Senkaku Islands, which, without a presentation of any title based on international law in 1971. The major elements of the PRC's arguments are as follows. The Senkaku Islands are not terra nullius, but inherent territory of the PRC based on the historical facts such as discovery, naming, and utilized for long by China. Japan deprived the Senkaku Islands, part of Taiwan, by peace treaty between Japan and Qing in 1895. Japan accepted the Potsdam Declaration and should return the Senkaku Islands to the PRC because they are part of Taiwan. The PRC first assertion of the territorial claims over the Senkaku Islands were 76 years after Japan's cabinet decision of incorporation. The PRC enacted law on the territorial sea and contiguous zone in 1992. The PRC's government ships suddenly intrude into the territorial waters around the Senkaku Island in 2008. They persistently stayed in the territorial sea, and recently they stayed in the contiguous zone around the Senkaku Islands more than 100 days in a row. The PRC legislated CCG law in January 2021 and carried out in February of the same year. Article 21 of the CCG law, which provides for the coercive measures against foreign warships and government imminent ships, authorizing the CCG to take the necessary warning and control measures to expel foreign warships and government ships that violate domestic laws of the waters under the PRC's jurisdiction. In situations related to sovereignty and maritime rights, a CCG ship can use all necessary means, including use of weapons. The CCG ships engaged in national defense operations under the related defense laws and regulations that and command of the PRC Central Military Committee. According to the Japan Coast Guard law, in a foreign vessel is conducting a navigation which is not innocent passage in the territorial waters or territorial sea of Japan, and there are reasonably grounds to believe that there were no other means to stop such a navigation, JCG ships may use a weapon in the extent judged reasonably necessary. However, this provision is not applicable to foreign warships and ships operated by the foreign governments. There is an argument on use of weapons in Japan that when a CCG ship sees a JCG ship or a Japanese fishing boat, and if the lives or bodies of the crew members are in danger, and when there are no other means to save them, then JCG ships could conduct harmful shooting. When there is a law enforcement mission that exceeds JCG's capability, the Maritime Self-Defense Force assumes the duty of maritime security patrol policing operations under the order of the Minister of Defense. When a CCG ship engages in law enforcement activities in the waters around the Senkaku Islands, then a JCG ship considers it as a violation of Japan's laws and order. There is a possibility of mass water discharge and or ramming against a JCG ships by a CCG ships, such as they did it against the Vietnamese Coast Guard ships in the south of China Sea. Japan Coast Guard faces tough missions to tackle the PRC's hybrid strategy, which deploys CCG ships on the front and PLA Navy vessels at the rear. The U.S. force is obliged to support Japan when the PRC attacks Japan by use of force in accordance with Article 5 of the Japan and U.S. Security Treaty. The PRC will not want to fight against the U.S., so CCG ships will carefully avoid use of force in peacetime. it is called gray zone situation in Japan. If JCG ships are excluded by the CCG ships from the territorial waters around the Senkaku Islands, then it is possible that the international community recognizes that the islands belongs to the PRC's territory. As for recent activities of international community to tackle the PRC's maritime expansion in East Asia, the Japan Self-Defense Force is operating with its allies and partners in protecting freedom of navigation at sea and air in the region by conducting patrol and exercises. Japan Ground Self-Defense Force exercises rapid deployment, defense, and recapture of the remote islands within Army of the US, France, Australia, and so on in 2021. Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force conducted maritime drill with the US and the British carrier strike groups, together with vessels from Canada, Netherlands, and New Zealand in October 2021. Japan, the US, Australia, and India established the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue (QUAD) for maritime cooperation in the free and open Indo-Pacific area, and the regular meeting started in September 2021. Japanese official information and documents on the Senkaku Islands are found at the following websites: Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Office of Planning and Coordination on the Territory and Sovereignty of the Cabinet Secretariat. And there is a National Museum of Territory Sovereignty in Tokyo, where it exhibits lots of information and explanation panels. As I explained in my presentation, the PRC has been pursuing the control of the Senkaku Islands and waters around them with its hybrid strategy. I really appreciate for your comments and exchange of opinions about 3 topics in the virtual seminar as follows. When maritime security communication mechanism between the PRC will work effective, what measures should Japan take to prevent escalation from the current standoff of law enforcement ships to armed conflict? What should Japan do to get the world known the real situations in the waters around the Senkaku Islands? Thank you very much for your attention. Now, Professor Okamatsu, the virtual seminar is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Takai. Professor Takai briefly introduced the historical background and current situation of Senkaku Islands and made the problems to be discussed very clear. So then we will have 3 sessions focusing on 3 topics as Professor Takai showed us in his presentations. And the first session will be the effectiveness of the maritime and aerial communication mechanism between Japan and China. And we have 3 panelists in this session. The first panelist is Mr. Yoji Koda. So, Mr. Yoji Koda, please start your presentation.
Thank you very much, Professor Okamatsu. So let me focus on my main subject and effectiveness of the maritime and the area's communication at sea, especially between Japan. There have been a lot of effort during last 2 decades, at least 2 decades period. But the only and practical agreement was the 2018, the agreement of the Japan-China Maritime and Aerial Communications Mechanism, or simply the MACM. This is really a bilateral mechanism to maintain the minimum communication between 2 military forces meeting or making a close encounter at sea, that could lead a larger expansion of the military clashes between the two countries. Very lengthy and laborious, time-consuming negotiations, the 2018 agreement was reached. There are goods and bads. One positive side is the mechanism covered to host at least the regular annual meeting between the two countries, especially the military officials and the foreign officials. But the bad side is this is simply the communication mechanism. So that does not cover the preventive measure when two forces or two military units are really in danger. So this is very different from the incident at sea agreement between Soviet and US, or Russia and Japan, or Russia and NATO. So the lack of this part, I mean the agreement to prevent the real dangerous situation, is the next step to go. But at least as long as I understand, there is no real political intent or will to get things done within a few years. So that is the one of the largest the bad of this the mechanism. Both Tokyo and Beijing have to do a lot to make this very dangerous situation, almost reaching to the flashing point, under control.
Okay, so the next panelist in this session is Dr. James Kraskar. Please start.
Thank you very much. I have a very sort of dark view of any sort of benefit to come out of a bilateral communication mechanism with China. And my view is based on the US experience. The US experience during the EP3 incident in 2001 demonstrated that apparently the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China were not coordinating. 20 years on, probably the CCP has a greater control over what's going on, and that leads me to be rather skeptical that there's a benefit, because in my view, it's almost certainly to be just part of China's plan to either delay during a crisis or to diminish the rights that exist if you're talking about a deliberative mechanism. And it was something that I think we all have experienced in dealing with Chinese scholars, which is that you're not going to find any sort of common ground, unfortunately, and that you're just going to endlessly be subjected to government talking points on the part of China. It will be at best frustrating for Japan, and at worst, it will result in eroding or diminishing the legal norms that we already have, because China will be relentless in this regard. China is continually trying to erode or diminish or water down the norms that are already binding in the international system. And at the same time, even if they agree to something, they don't comply with it.
Okay, thank you very much. So first, Mr. Koda introduced some communication tools between China and Japan and China, and Dr. Krasker showed us the experience, U.S. experience, and indicate what is effective, the relationship between China and Japan. But unfortunately, we couldn't find a positive resolution so far. So do you have any comments each other, listening to the comments?
Especially observing the Chinese behaviors and maneuvers during the last 20 years, both South China Sea and in East China Sea. China is not a nation to really follow the established, long-lasting international norm that has been a treasure of the human beings for 3,000, 4,000 years. China, most of the case, ignores and really, say, force their own theory or rhetoric to the international communities, especially at sea. So really, when we take one thing, one sentiment, kind of common sentiment that Japanese people still maintain or preserve is, some point in the future, if we behave sincerely toward China, China would change itself and transform itself to meet the international norm. We have to be very careful. Yeah. But say, especially Chinese strategy and political strategy and the tactics. And sometimes, that will, I'd say, trap US and Japan or other, the like-minded countries, and really they establish Chinese own national objectives that is favorable and support Chinese, the economy and the security.
Thank you very much, Dr. Krashka. Do you have something to add?
I would just add that because this is undergirded by power dynamics, if I were Japan, what I would suggest is to try to bring the U.S. 7th Fleet into an arrangement where either for crisis or deliberate communications, the exact same thing ought to occur with the Philippines in the South China Sea. Maybe there with the Coast Guard or perhaps even the U.S. Navy, where there should be combined alliance structure where China is not dealing individually with countries. So my view would be, if you're going to do a arrangement like this, if it's possible, it should at least be explored that it is done in conjunction with the U.S. as a treaty ally, and both sides would have to agree on that. And then China would actually have to have greater pause for its behavior.
Okay, thank you very much. There is a big difference between US and Japan regarding the military powers and relationship between Japan and China. So, what do you think that the United States, how the United States contribute to this conflict as a partner of Japan under the security treaty? Well, Senkaku Islands is of course, is a scope of the security treaty between the United States and Japan. So how can the United States contribute to the Japanese safety?
So my view is that the United States ought to be explicit that the Senkaku Islands are part of Japan. But when the United States says that it does not take a position, in fact, it takes a position. It had a position. It changed its position. This was due to the convenience of the Cold War and the need to leverage China against the Soviet Union. I think that the United States might return to its previous position. And by saying we don't take a position, of course, all we're doing is eroding extended deterrence.
Thank you very much. So I think it's time to open up to everyone.
Can I say just one?
Sure.
One quick thing of the South China Sea. In Japan, it is not well reported and discussed, but the code of conduct negotiation has been on for last the 5 years or so among the ASEAN nations and the China. There are two bottom lines from Japanese point of view. One is the code of conduct should be in full compliance with the UNCLOS. The code of conduct, COC, should be a kind of the subordinate local regulation that fully reflects and take the major part or the concept of the UNCLOS into consideration. And second thing is, COC should not be a mechanism to exclude the geo-outsider nations like the US or Japan, because they are the high seas in South China Sea.
Thank you very much. Do you have something to add?
Okay, I have very sketchy information about MACM that was signed between China and Japan, I think in 2018, right? Most of the time when there is an incident, let's say in the South China Sea, usually it comes from the orders comes from quite high from Beijing. And therefore, the officials involved in the communications mechanisms that we usually have, at the lower ranking level, those officials have a duty to implement Beijing orders and have very little impact on changing those orders. And therefore, having communications with them is not going to help as much when a crisis broke up. When Vietnam had the incidents in 2014, when China sends the oil rig into Vietnam's exclusive economic zones, we use a lot of channels, hotline, long established line of communication, but the Chinese are simply not willing to communicate.
So essentially the combination of continuing to use the mechanisms that you have with China to prevent accidents and escalation of tensions, emphasize defense and deterrence, and continue demonstrating that you are governing and administrating the territories by applying, of course, domestic legislation.
Okay, thank you very much. But the one thing, code of conduct doesn't have a legal binding power, so it's a little bit different from the compliance with the international law. Right. Okay, thank you very much. Then we will move on to the second session. The second session is measured to avoid escalation from confrontation to armed conflict between law enforcement vessels of Japan and China. So we have today two panelists in this session. And first, we have Dr. J. Batong-Bakal. So please start the presentation.
Thank you, Komatsu-san. Now, many of you might have noticed on the 9th of November 16, 3 China Coast Guard vessels intercepted 2 wooden Philippine vessels on their way to resupply a Philippine outpost on Second Thomas Shoal in the South China Sea, and there was a near collision, as far as I can tell. And one of the Philippine vessels, which was large, they were both large wooden vessels, but one of them, which was an outrigger type of vessel, lost one of its outriggers. So the Philippine vessels were forced to abandon their mission and withdraw. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a statement in a press conference stating Chinese Coast Guard vessels performed their official duties in accordance with law and upheld China's territorial sovereignty and maritime order. Noticeably, this took place despite, number one, the Philippine Navy having already adjusted to China's view of Philippine military vessels as provocative. That's why they're using civilian vessels. And second, this is despite the supposed understanding already between China and the Philippines on account of President Duterte's policies. These incidents have all involved coercive and dangerous interactions, such as the use of water cannon against wooden traditional fishing vessels of smaller size, ramming, again, of these vessels, confiscation of fishing gear and catch, armed surveillance and intimidation of vessels using small boats and armed men, approaching and shadowing of vessels, and interference with navigation, including dangerous maneuvering like crossing the beam. This demonstrated the existence of naval assets for sea denial and sea control operations already in the area, based in the area itself, in addition to the maritime law enforcement assets. CCG vessels have also been regularly present together with vessels of the Chinese maritime militia in the sea areas around Philippine-occupied islands. So all of these activities constitute what I call layering the cabbage, a reference to the cabbage strategy of China, of employing, of trying to wrap layer upon layer of coercive and exclusionary measures around disputed features and waters, using their law enforcement, paramilitary, and military forces as a means of gaining de facto control and administration of these disputed areas. Now, the justification by China of its actions really proves that the China Coast Guard Act, as already discussed, will be used and applied by China well beyond its legitimate areas of jurisdiction, and they will use it to assert their claims. Now, given this, I think, incidentally, we should consider probably the legality of their favorite measures, this use of water cannon and ramming. While it might not be an armed attack in a traditional sense, perhaps we should now reconsider this assumption given the kinds of water cannons that are being designed and employed by China, because they are the most powerful cannons. Now, notably, there's mention of the code of conduct. There have been proposals for hotlines and queues-like arrangements to mitigate the behavior of ships. But the thing is, even if we assume that agreements are reached to avoid interactions that cause damage or injury, those rules ultimately might only take the edge off of China's presence and operations. And that is the incremental establishment of de facto control through layers and layers of coercive forces around the area. They will therefore not effectively counter China's cabbage strategy. So I guess my final point would be that establishing norms for encounters between law enforcement vessels at sea and trying to minimize damaging or injurious interactions is good, but they must also always be seen in the broader context of China's acquisition strategies.
Thank you very much. So the second panelist, the second panelist is Dr. Robert McMullen. Please.
Thank you very much, Akiko. I guess the comment I'd like to make is that one key to keeping the situation around the Senkakus characterized as incidents of confrontation, but not as an armed conflict at sea, is to actually maintain the Japan Coast Guard as the main on-water actor, with the JMSDF warships perhaps in standoff positions as necessary to support. So why do I say this? I think there are three reasons to try and maintain the Japan Coast Guard's primacy as the on-water actor in these situations. The first is that this allows Japan to keep characterizing these interactions politically, legally, and operationally as being incidents between maritime law enforcement forces rather than as between military forces. The second reason to maintain the JCG as the main on-water actor in these confrontations is that it allows Japan to focus international attention on the excessive nature, as Professor Takai mentioned in his opening remarks, the excessive nature of the China Coast Guard's claimed authorizations under the new Coast Guard law. This will assist in keeping the dispute characterized as one of competing jurisdictions, which is a maritime law enforcement matter, rather than as one of competing territorial claims or sovereignty. I think the third reason to maintain Japan Coast Guard primacy in these confrontations is that the Japan Coast Guard will continue to bring a maritime law enforcement mindset and rules of engagement to these confrontations. And this will help to make it clear that from Japan's perspective, this remains a jurisdictional confrontation. Now, there are a number of possible challenges and problems. The China Coast Guard is in fact part of the People's Armed Police, and that operates under the control of the People's Liberation Army. So this means that the China Coast Guard is also a paramilitary force. The second thing is we always have to be very aware, and this is something I think that Admiral Koda was also mentioning, we must also be aware of the potential for tactical overmatch at sea. The third is that we need to contend with the problematic Guyana and Suriname arbitration precedent, and the idea that a threat or use of force can arise in some maritime law enforcement operations. I think that this is a really unhelpful precedent. Finally, I think there's the problem of the current uncertainty around what is a military activity, for example, under the Law of the Sea Convention, Article 298. And we obviously need to be aware that this use of lawfare and this is a growing tactic in hybrid warfare.
Thank you very much, Dr. Robert McMullen. Do you want to add something? Okay, Alessio?
Thank you very much, Okamatsu-sensei. From my perspective, when we're looking at the Senkaku issues, we're not looking at the legal matter. We're looking at a political and strategic issue in which the law is mobilized to pursue ends of political and strategic nature. And it's about, when we talk about the Senkaku, it's about over the sovereign aspect, and in particular, as it is manifested in manifestation of control over the islands. Chinese strategy really is about 3 steps. One was to normalize its presence since 2012 onwards. First was to normalize its presence around the islands. Number 2 was to challenge or contest the Japanese administrative control of the islands, which is what happened really at the beginning of 2020. And then eventually to replace Japan, or at least establish what is a firmly contested control of the islands. And the data in terms of the operational conduct of the Chinese Coast Guard and over the last year in particular reinforces this notion. You have 333 days of presence around in the contiguous zone around the islands, which is short basically of a year. They were going inside only when there was actual activity inside the territorial waters, fishing activities. They would go inside, chase after Japanese fishermen, and then go out again. And that is the core of the matter from a political point of view, because what they were doing de facto, they were exercising their rights as a coastal states to go after whoever is illegally fishing in their territorial waters by maintaining a presence. So, in this context, what has the Chinese Coast Guard law, this was one of the questions that was asked to us, done to change things? Frankly, at the operational level, the Chinese Coast Guard law kind of like formalized something that was already happening. The first time that you have armed vessels entering the waters around the Senkaku Islands was in December 2015. So from an operational perspective, it's not that the Coast Guard law has significantly changed, but rather created a context for a political coverage to sanction and make sort of normalize what operationally had already been a trend that was in place. I completely agree with what James was saying, except perhaps I would suggest that that's the fact that the Coast Guard law is bringing the Coast Guard within the command and control structure of the Chinese military. It raises the question, at the Japanese end at the very least, as to why are we not having a conversation about maritime and air communication mechanisms that includes also the Coast Guards. So these organizations should be at the forefront of the conversation about communication mechanism, crisis prevention mechanism. I do think there is a need for a proper conversation about that Coast Guard to Coast Guard interaction. And in a way, the Coast Guard law presents almost the ideal opportunity at the Japanese end to go to the Chinese and like, look, now you put them under the chain of command, the military chain of command, then perhaps we should include them into the conversation. I also believe that a lot of what has happened, including the Coast Guard law, is not just about the Senkakus. Here, the real game in the East China Sea at the moment is the Taiwan Straits. Unfortunately, the position of the Senkakus and the strategic dimension of the East China Sea does not allow the Japanese government to think about the Senkakus just purely as a sovereignty dispute. It is also speaking to the broader strategic question. In this case, the strengthening of the southwestern side of the Japanese sort of military posture, particularly in ISR capabilities, I think it will continue to remain a very important priority. If they come in with bigger guns, that will demand Japanese law to have the military to be involved into this. But at the same time, there is also a very important conversation to have with the United States, not so much around the Senkakus, but around the bigger issues in the East China Sea. Most notably, continue to develop cooperation and coordination insofar as Taiwan Strait scenarios contingencies are concerned.
Thank you very much, and it covers a lot of issues around Senkaku Islands, not only Senkaku Islands, but also in the other issues. So, do you have any comments on the panelist comment? Or do you want to add something after listening to the others?
Let's say in the short to midterm, China is really trying to force Japan to acknowledge that there is a dispute over competing territorial claims and sovereignty, because of course Japan's position has been there's no dispute over territories, right? So Japan essentially has been looking at it as an issue that concerns jurisdictional claims, but not sovereignty and territorial claims. And these are quite significant differences. So the Chinese argument is this, that if the Senkakus are no longer administered by Japan, then the Chinese thinking is this will undermine America's commitment. And this is in line with the general policy of wedging, strategic wedging, which China essentially has been pursuing, trying to, create a wedge in US alliances in Asia. But I think is the danger for Japan that if you really cross the line and you want to deploy, let's say the maritime self-defense forces, you're already signaling that you're, in my view, preparing for some sort of military confrontation, which goes also, in my view, beyond the line of dealing with jurisdictional claims. Exactly, I think China is targeting or seeking that response to sort of induce that kind of behavior from Japan in order to argue you escalated the tensions and now we will be deploying even more force in order to deal with the situation.
Can I ask a question to Rob? When we're thinking about grey zone or hybrid, Japan has a clear distinction between law enforcement and military intervention. And at the moment, legally, as Takai-sensei's presentation was making quite abundantly clear, the Coast Guard use of weapons, if you want, is very constrained and under very specific circumstances. But to what extent do you think, by keeping the Japanese Coast Guard at the front line of this, at the same time, what kind of step you think should be taken to increase the integration and interoperability between the Coast Guard and the military as a way to reduce that grey zone hybrid space that the Chinese are so fond of?
The Chinese are already, you could see the way they're doing this in the South China Sea, around Tratas, in the Taiwan Strait and around the Senkakus. They're now linking that up with a much more aggressive and robust maritime law enforcement approach and assets. Chinese Coast Guard vessels equate to warships in many places. They're that large and that well armed. The second thing is they're coordinating them, and which is a point you made. That's what they're doing. They're exactly that. They're coordinating all of these maritime assets, including the maritime militia, in a very operationally controlled way, in order to create the opportunity to exercise hybrid warfare at sea with this, this very diverse set of assets that they can use. So to get to the key of your question, what does that mean for the Japan Coast Guard and the JMSDF? They need to interact much more. So we've got to start thinking about how there's a continuum rather than a separation between JCG operations and JMSDF operations, because that is something we're going to...
The one thing that I might add is that one of the problems in international law has been the expansion, or even the creation, if not the expansion, of this gray zone through principal cases, including the Nicaragua decision and the oil platforms decision, which recognizes that states can use force without triggering the right of self-defense on behalf of the injured party. And so gray zone is not new. You have a on-scene commander that can exercise force in the face of a hostile act, not an armed attack, a hostile act, or even just a demonstration of hostile intent. So any U.S. warship commander can start World War III. And I think that actually is better for deterrence, ROE, that a demonstration of hostile intent or even a hostile act necessarily will always result in defensive use of force, but it makes it more available. And I do think that probably gives adversaries pause. So that might be something concrete that could be done.
Thank you very much. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, I agree completely with the question posed by Robin. The problem we have right now, I think that in trying to address China's white ships with our own white ships, what people call the white on white strategy. The problem is that the disparity in power between the two sides are even greater on the white on the white ship level. Actually, are setting ourselves up for a kind of competition in which we are sorely disadvantaged. And the only way to try to equalize the odds really should be to put all in, all our assets into it, not just the white ships, but even the gray ships. We're going to reach a point, I think, where our own weakness will be what will result in victory on the part of the other on the other side.
We are very clear in protecting the sovereignty, our outpost, and our exclusive economic zones, and so on. And the intention needs to be very clear. Also, we have to, in the short term, we also have to show a credible deterrent force. And that's what Vietnam is doing, and that's what many Southeast Asian countries are doing. I think it's also useful to make your views very clear on matters pertaining to international law. So Vietnam, for example, need to speak more about East China Sea, and Japan need to speak more about South China Sea. And we should encourage the international community to speak more about both the East China Sea and South China Sea in order to build that rules-based international order.
May I offer a two-finger? The only way to get ahead of this, in my view, is something that just may not be politically possible, which is that the United States and other countries have to really increase the size of their coast guards, and then they have to operate together. But the question is, can our countries get there? And again, it's not easy to be optimistic.
As a Japanese old sailor, I have to say something. And the interoperability between JCG and JMSDF has been improving. So bringing the two forces together at sea still have some difficulties, but we are now overcoming those problems. And the second thing is really Japan. Japan Coast Guard is perhaps the third largest Coast Guard, but they are also getting tired of the taking care of the Senkaku. I think Japan is prepared to do maybe next several decades or even the century. But Japan has Japanese people. Do you think Japanese people have no intent to make any compromise over Chinese? So that's one thing China has to understand. And also, the aid or cooperation with the ASEAN nations or ASEAN nations in terms of the maritime law enforcement capability. Of course, they say operating together or cooperation at South China Sea is one thing, and also Japan is also helping to develop Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and several other countries' Coast Guard capabilities. And one last thing is, the military relationship Japan and the United States, especially Japanese point of view. Japan should free the U.S. 7th Fleet or U.S. Air Force and U.S. Marine from those tiny islands. U.S. military has a much larger roles to do. And of course, JSDF is large enough, capable enough. If the political decision is made, this is the condition.
Thank you very much. So time is up. If I summarize these sessions in very short sentence, I think the key word is the Dr. McLaughlin mentions in his presentation the conflict of the jurisdiction between military and administrations. So as far as the Japanese government distinguished the military power from the Coast Guard, military, the administrations, it doesn't extend to the use of force, or we can avoid the war. However, the unilateral measures by the Chinese government is unclear if it is a military use or not. So it's a use between the Article 298 of UNCLOS or not. So that is a key point when we avoid the military confrontation between two states. So the jurisdiction of the military and administrations, since Japanese self-defense force has a strictly limited to use the military power. So the jurisdiction, the confrontation or the conflicts of jurisdiction is a keyword in this session. The last session is how to effectively communicate the danger of the Senkaku Islands issue to the world. Well, Senkaku Islands are located in the East Asia, everyone knows. And as a matter of the legal status of the territory, there is nothing to be discussed if China complies with the rule of international law. Unfortunately, China invades Japanese territory and it becomes not only a regional conflict, but also a serious international problems in terms of the international security. So how we are able to share the common understanding on the current situation that China is against the rule of law in international society regarding Senkaku Islands. Well, today we only have one panelist in this session. So Dr. Ever Pajsova, you have a lot of time. So please offer the comments.
Thank you very much, Okamatsu-sensei. First of all, I think that the question of effective communication is absolutely crucial, because if you look at it, while Chinese kind of growingly assertive actions in its maritime neighborhood are well commented on, the East China Sea and the Senkaku dispute receive generally much less attention than comparing to the South China Sea, for instance. Well, first of all, because there's, legally speaking, relatively less ambiguity as for the sovereignty or jurisdiction, Japanese jurisdiction over the islands, based on the legal documents that we know, San Francisco Treaty or the previous ones. And of course, secondly, because it's exacerbated by the historical and diplomatic tensions between the two countries, which complicate all the issues that we discussed, including whatever communication mechanism, whether we need it or not. But if I may add, it seems to me that the toolbox is virtually limitless in the case of China, because we can include the use of economic coercion that we have seen in far more distant areas, but of course also in the South China Sea, the use of hacktivism, propaganda, whether it's designed for its own domestic audience or to coerce the smaller countries on the other side of the table. And of course, it's dangerous because it allows Beijing to exercise control and to win without fighting, which is really what we are talking about when we look at Chinese strategy. And to add another layer, since we're talking about maritime security, there is a latest adage to this. In September 2021, just a few months ago, China actually approved its revision of its maritime traffic safety law, which hasn't been mentioned. I understand this is very much against the UNCLOS provisions. And in fact, if that would be applicable in much broader areas, it is against the principle of innocent passage or even the freedom of navigation. Just to say that, it is the Coast Guard law is not an isolated case, and we may likely see more tools in this sort of lawfare International attention is absolutely necessary, because whatever happens in the East China Sea, Japan will need international support. And Japan, as the kind of lasting vocal supporter of rules-based order regionally and globally, really needs to take the lead. So among some of the recommendations and suggestions, since we were asked, I think there would be mostly two strands. One, to engage more with the academic and legal community to get an objective inquiry into the question. But even more so, involving more international lawyers can eventually produce more papers, more policy recommendations, and shift the problem to higher policymaking spheres, which is absolutely crucial. The support of some of the government led programs, Japan chairs, academic institutions, is extremely important. The other strand would be related. It's more in gathering diplomatic support, let's say at the UN level. Of course, we're not there yet in the case of Senkaku, but perhaps preparing and consulting with like-minded partners within these multilateral forums would be something that can play in favor ultimately of Japan's government. And as a very last resort, and I know that this is a notoriously unpopular suggestion in Japan, but perhaps explore the possibility to take some sort of legal action against China's intrusions, with all the caveats that we have. Of course, quite aware of the pitfalls of the suggestions, but it is nonetheless one of the items that can be on the table.
Thank you very much. Well, as Dr. Pejsova mentioned in her presentations, I absolutely agree to the Philippines case against China. So after having a judgment at the International Tribunal of the Sea regarding the South China Sea between Philippines and China, I felt how clever Philippines is to win the case without mentioning the delimitation issues. But, well, the Philippines succeeded in appealing that these areas are, well, not clearly mentioned, but, well, actually, it indicates that these EEZ is within the territory of the, this is the Philippines EEZ. Do you have any comments about this, Dr. Jay? So from the Philippines experience?
Yes. Yes, definitely it was certainly an interesting approach, and it was the product of extended discussions, no? As early as 2010, 2011, the idea was being floated, no? And it's the whole, because it really brought to the center the whole question of do you really want an international community that is about the rule of law, or will it be about the rule of the jungle? And also, it presents a choice for international lawyers and international relations experts about the kind of international community that you want to live in a way. So that's why it's still very contentious, even though it's been decided. It's still contentious even without China's continuing propaganda campaign against it.
Yes, so Philippines won that these areas are within the Philippines jurisdictions, and also it shows that China doesn't comply with the international law. Do you have any comments on that, and do you have any good ideas that how the Japanese government effectively communicates or to let the dangerous situation to the international society, to know the international society?
Two important tools are the use of diplomacy and education together. These are really, in my view, critical and powerful tools in Japan's strategy. For example, in the framework of really high-level meetings, track one diplomacy, I think Japan very much has to raise the issue and provide a more detailed explanation of Japan's perspective, Japan's concerns. If I refer back to the European situation, younger generation in Europe are really, there is a lot of interest in the Asia or Indo-Pacific, but the understanding is very limited. The younger generation of Europeans who will be our, of course, future European leaders, right? And who will be engaging in Euro-Japanese relations. So I think that's very important. I think the second aspect of making the international community more aware would be international law perspective. And Japan really has to focus on the strength of its sovereignty claim according to international law. And there are 2 points I would like to mention here. One, Japan incorporated the SENKAKUS as a vacant territory, terra nullius. One, that's first point. Second, Japan demonstrated effective control, which went unchallenged for a very long time. And you even had also Japanese people living on the Senkakus.
Yes, I'd like to pick up on one of Eva's many excellent points. Eva said that we should be, doing a lot more talking about China's use of ambiguity, and I think that's absolutely correct. China have become very expert at creating and then exploiting ambiguities to erode sort of those normative fundamentals, which most of us thought were pretty settled, and then they use that to then reinforce further more spurious interpretations of and very questionable legal interpretations, for example. We ought to do that. We ought to expose where the ambiguity is sham. There is no ambiguity. It's just constructed to try and confect this other conferral of spurious legitimacy on a completely spurious interpretation. I think
you can never keep track of all of them. For example, exactly what Professor McLaughlin just mentioned, which is it's well settled that the territorial sea is 12 nautical miles in breadth. The Chinese would say, that's true. You may elect to have a 12 nautical mile territorial sea, but there's nothing under the Lotus principle that prevents a 14-mile territorial sea. It's true that 12 is lawful, but there's nothing that says that 14 is unlawful, or 17, or 27, or 44, or 77, or any other number. And so it really is quite pointless. And there are just too many variables that make any sort of discussion absolutely unfruitful, unfortunately.
Well, in order to maintain international attention on the East China Sea, I think it's important to promote the narrative that the South China Sea and East China Sea are the same problem. So I think it's important for the international community to look at the East China Sea or South China Sea in that term, rather than taking just the Senkaku or Parasol or Spratly as isolated territorial disputes. They are not. They are interconnected issues that tells the same story. Secondly, we need to multilateralize, as I said. And again, 2014, our experience was that we brought international attention through the help of ASEAN, through the help of friends like our close friends like Japan, like the EU, like India, like the United States. All of these countries brought international attention onto China's behavior in the South China Sea.
Thank you very much. So, Mr. Koda, please make a comment in 1 minute.
And I really have the same feeling with Jim Klaska. Really get sick of the Chinese, the response. The Japanese government should be more aggressive on the propaganda campaign or campaign operations over Senkaku. For example, one example was the Vietnamese case in 2014 when the Chinese oil rig, they invaded into the off the coast of Da Nang, and Vietnamese practically gathered all hands possible and resisted. And China eventually said, okay, 1 month later, okay, mission complete, and we would withdraw. But actually, they announced 4 months operations. The one secret behind Vietnamese success in 2014, the Chinese oil rig case, was, Vietnamese invited international media freely, open, and Chinese eventually had to evacuate by saying mission complete in 1 month, 3 months left. But when we take a look at the Senkaku case, basically Japanese government is, through my eyes, trying to conceal everything happening there behind the curtain. But if something happens, Japanese government should have a plan and strategy and tactics to invite foreign media to the scene and make a kind of the world scale announcement. And if we think, or the government thinks the Japanese sovereignty is in jeopardy, the Japanese government should take more aggressive attitude on the communication campaign.
Thank you very much. And we will have a last comment from Dr. Patalano.
I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that things have changed over the last 2 years. I think the last 18 months, 2 years have been a really bad example of how things have deteriorated academically in China. Look, we have to understand the Senkaku issue is seen predominantly as much as I argue for the opposite. It is predominantly seen as a bilateral affair between China and Japan of little consequence to the rest of the world. And in that sense, so how do you do that? Well, by having a behavior which under the Abe administration put Japan on a much bigger map. Rule of law was a big topic under Abe, was a part of the elements of the FOIP initiative. And within that context, international attention grew insofar as Japan is concerned. And within that context, also towards the Senkakus. If you start seeing this from a UK perspective, for example, having a conversation with Japan about the Senkaku needs to be placed into that broader context.
Thank you very much. So everyone is fine with the sessions. So I will close this session. And many topics, issues, items are running together in me. But I have to wrap up these sessions in 1 minute. So Senkaku Islands legally belongs to Japan without any doubt. However, Chinese military action, unilateral action, makes it a political issue. So in the first session, several communication mechanisms between China and Japan are shown, but any of them are not working very well. And one more thing which makes the situation worse is that China uses military force according to the Coast Guard law as a law enforcement mechanism, and which may bring the escalation of its action to the use of force against Japan. So then the measures to show our position will be very important. So Japan should appeal that the Chinese activities around Senkaku Islands and law enforcement activity might be dangerous, and it is a breach of international law as well. and we can get the lessons from many states so that we try to establish the network for the strategy against China altogether. So is there any comments to add? Okay. So it is a very fruitful seminar, and thank you very much for all participants. And it is my great honor to moderate this session. Thank you very much for your cooperation. And then we will move on to the closing remarks by Professor Takai.
Thank you very much for excellent and distinguished opinion and fruitful discussion on the three topics that were raised in this virtual seminar. Now, I'd like to close the seminar. Thank you very much again.